Good morning. Good morning. Welcome. And good morning to those who are joining us on the live stream from all over the world. We appreciate all the interest in this topic. I'm Raj Kumar. I'm President and Editor-in-Chief here at Devex. This is one of the more fun things we do at Devex. You see our journalism on topics like governance every day. But occasionally we think issues are so important that we want to dig a little bit deeper. And this is definitely one of those. I was actually at an event last night with some members of Congress. And as soon as you start talking about development, the first issues you hear are corruption and waste. Not unimportant, but it shows you that the issue of governance is still seen often with this negative light, that there are parts of the world that just don't have the right institutions and we're kind of stuck. And we want to talk today about actually the opportunities, the other side of the coin on governance. There are big opportunities, and in particular, probably the biggest one in the world today is unlocking the economic potential of women. And there was a report several years ago that has been thrown around like crazy, and this is the McKinsey report that you've seen that has this giant dollar amount that's almost unfathomable. $12 trillion can be unlocked if women have a more equal role in the economy. Sounds great. Well, we have today for our conversation someone who's actually working on unlocking that money, someone who's thinking about what can we positively do in terms of laws, regulations, policies, business practices, finance that actually can move that needle. And that, for us at Devex, is a really critical issue. We want to spend some time digging into it this morning. We'll talk more about that in a moment, but when we do events like this, we always try to bring in a partner. And our partner for this event is Pact. Mark Weiss is here, the president and CEO of Pact. And I was just saying to him outside, it's not always the case that we find a partner that is so perfectly aligned with the issue. I just wrote a book, and I can say that now because it was just a week ago, but I'll probably keep saying that for the next couple of years. It's called The Business of Changing the World. And one of the things I talk about in that book is how our industry is really changing rapidly, and that to succeed in this future, organizations are going to need to be much more locally rooted in their work. They can't just sit here in Washington and pontificate. We've got to be on the ground and really empowering people on the ground to do the work and lead. That organizations have to find ways to leverage and connect with the private sector. Again, not just to say that's a nice thing to do, we have a public-private partnership, but actually to find ways to use market mechanisms that drive change at scale. Not as easy to do if you look at it with that lens. And organizations need to change even their basic business model, where they get their funding from, how they execute projects, thinking from kind of a project mentality to a sustainable business model mentality. And all of those trends I see in Pact. And I don't know how well people know the organization, but one just little tidbit I'll tell you, there's something called a battery alliance that Pact has been driving. Just looking around the room to see if there's general awareness about this, and not so much. It's a good thing I'm bringing it up. The Battery Alliance is one of the more exciting things happening in our space that shows this new realm that I talk about in my book. Essentially, all of us right now have in our phones products that have come from the DRC. I mean, almost exclusively. I don't think anybody here has a device that does not have minerals that have come from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And huge corporations, Apple and Google, huge corporations are invested in how do we get these products out of the country, but in a way that's sustainable, that is humane, that respects the local people who are doing the work, and also it drives economic growth in the country. That is not an easy problem to solve. That's the kind of wicked problem that in development we actually need to tackle. And Pact set up an alliance saying we'll bring together all of those purchasers of these products. We'll bring together governments, NGOs, local organizations, and actually solve this in an alliance model. That is the future. That's the kind of place we're heading when we think about where is governance going. So I want to ask Mark to just come up and give us some introductory remarks to get us going as we begin this series on governance, and then we'll get to our interview in a moment. Mark.
Thank you, Raj, and I'm going to have to put this here. You'll forgive me if I read a little bit, but since Raj brought it up, which I'm shocked he did, this is his book. And I got it the other day, and so I haven't read it all. And Raj talked a little bit about what he wrote about, and I want to be so bold as to suggest there's an early phrase and passage that explains, I think, why he wrote it. It says in the early part in the prologue, it says, "It was a chance to see the humanity in all people, no matter their hardships, and a gut-wrenching realization that no one should be forced to live in such severe poverty." I think that's why he wrote the book, and I'm glad he did. You'll have to get it to find out what it was that he's referring to, so hopefully that'll spur you to go on Amazon and get it. It comes in a day. Thank you, Raj. Good morning. Thank you for letting us be a part of this event. It's a deep privilege and honor and a delight to be a part of this topic given how critical it is to the work that all of us do, particularly at Pact. Enabling environments and gender equality and equity is critical and part of our DNA, and so we're deeply privileged to be able to introduce this topic. I'll try to be brief because I know you really came to hear from Henriette, but I'd like to share a little bit about why I think we're here today. You know, as Raj mentioned, for decades, the international development community has been tackling poverty and marginalization. We've made demonstrable progress around the globe. We've reduced maternal mortality, saved millions of lives from HIV and AIDS, and enrolled millions more children in primary education in Africa than there were just 2 decades ago. Tremendous progress. And yet the underlying causes of this poverty and marginalization that Raj refers to in his book are stubborn and remain, including rampant gender inequality. Our efforts together, collectively, while necessary and have done some good things, are completely insufficient to actually end poverty and create a more prosperous, just, and equal world. If we hope to achieve Sustainable Development Goal 5 around gender equality, or any of the SDGs for that matter, we must attack the systemic impediments that rob people of the ability to, what we say in Pact, is our goal, for people to own their future. Like the political, economic, social, and environmental challenges that continue to disproportionately disadvantage women. Women are saddled with the overwhelming burden of care. They make up the lion's share of informal work, and they are often barred from owning or even inheriting land or property. But there are opportunities we can seize to ensure a more gender equitable world. Improving women's access to adequate capital and financial products and services, financial inclusion, ensuring sustainable livelihoods, providing technical and vocational job training, ensuring inclusive markets and making sure the markets are responsive to the needs of women and women-owned micro, small, and medium enterprises, just to name a few things we can do. But more critically, and one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited about today's conversation with Henriette, is the opportunity to focus our efforts on creating and fostering enabling environments. And for Pact, that means both the legal framework and the environmental framework coming together that are needed for women to thrive. I believe this gets to the heart of the shift that we need to make as a development community, something Raj talks about in his book, where we need to move beyond looking at and treating the symptoms and rather shift our gaze and actions more to resolutely and doggedly approach and attack systemic solutions. But we can't do it alone, and I think we'll hear about that from Henriette today. If we're going to have a chance at change, we must invest in systemic solutions and partner with businesses, governments, local civil society, and what we at Pact call our shareholders, the communities whom we serve and who, at the end of the day, own all the actions that we do on their behalf in order to realize our goals. Thankfully, we see leadership from institutions like the IFC, who recognize the social, moral, and economic imperative of gender equality. Working with the private sector in developing countries, the IFC helps create markets that open up opportunities for everyone. It works to reduce gaps between men and women in the private sector, ensuring that they can equally participate in creating business value, securing influence, income for themselves, their families, and communities. One of the challenges for our community, the development community, as we look to the future, is how we work together, international institutions, the private sector, governments, civil society, businesses, to ensure that we're providing the greatest, most leverageable impact for women so that they can be the drivers to change their communities. One small step we can all take towards addressing that challenge is to engage with and leverage the many new and exciting initiatives, such as the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative and Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative, to ensure that women have the tools and resources that they need to thrive and own their future. So I want to thank Raj and the team at Devex for allowing me the opportunity to share a few rambling thoughts with you. And I'm delighted to hear from Henriette and the exciting discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you for bringing the book up on stage and getting it some attention. I appreciate that. I just want to say a couple more words before we jump into our interview. everybody's heard of the IFC in development. I'm not sure everyone fully understands it or its role. One of the things you may have noticed in our coverage at Devex is an increasing focus on development finance institutions, of which the IFC is the world's biggest and most influential. There is a huge trend toward more funding going into development finance institutions. The IFC alone is on track to be as big as the World Bank. It's a part of the World Bank group, but as big as the lending part of the World Bank by the end of the next decade. So the influence of these institutions on the private sector and on many of the things that we sort of take for granted in the developed world, like financial inclusion, is massive. Henriette is someone I've known for well over a decade now. She has been a leader on these issues because, frankly, these are issues that require leadership. Although it's obvious we should care about women's economic inclusion, the reality is many organizations, many funders, this is still a side issue. It has become more and more a central issue because of leaders like Henriette. And again, if you follow her career, which she's now been at the IFC for several years and heads the Gender Secretariat there, her own team has grown a lot. Her role within the institution has grown a lot, and she's a key person to discuss these issues with today. So we're delighted to have her. And my colleague, senior reporter Adva Saldinger, is someone whose byline you see all the time, especially on development finance issues. So we're delighted to dig into a real conversation with the two of them today. Thank you, and please take the stage.
Thank you.
Well, Henriette, I'm so glad that we have this opportunity to chat. And we were talking earlier about how I did an interview with you about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. But quite a bit has actually happened in that time frame, and we've seen a number of new initiatives announced, maturing, et cetera. So I'm really excited to have this conversation. And I think I want to start by talking to you about where you see the landscape today. So, and certainly women's economic empowerment is about capital. It's about access to finance in a lot of ways, but there are a lot of other factors. These sort of regulatory and legal hurdles, the societal norms that are sometimes holding women back from achieving true economic participation. And so when you look at the landscape today, what do you think needs to be done? Where are the key sort of roadblocks and policy and governance that need to be addressed to really give women that opportunity?
Great, thank you very much, Adva, and thanks to Mark and Devex as well for Raj to host us to an issue I think that's extremely essential if we want to unlock macroeconomic growth, company growth, but also if we want to be true to our twin goals, which is obviously sharing prosperity and reducing absolute poverty. I think business as usual won't get us there. And I know Devex has been particularly helpful in actually shining a spotlight on organizations that are trying to change this equation and bringing women and economic empowerment from sort of a hobby that you pick up at night when you've done all the other things into really sort of the mainstream of the conversation. And so before I go into what needs to be done, maybe just a couple of remarks around where we're at in terms of the gaps. And so just to take quickly stock, if we look at sort of, a couple of key pillars of women's economic empowerment, if we look at jobs, just to throw a couple of stats at you. So 2% of women are CEO of banks across the world, 2%. I just want to, maybe you two, could you just raise your hands in the front rows? Just you two, just raise your hands. They are the only women CEOs in the entire world. Just to bring perspective, it's extremely few. Now, then we go into, sort of the larger job equation. Women's labor force participation, 48%, 75% for men. What's shocking, though, and I think you cited a McKinsey report, and we will hopefully see soon another iteration of that, it seems that actually in some countries, labor force participation is declining and not really going up. So we have to watch the labor force participation, not just in terms of number of jobs, but better jobs very, very closely. Then just briefly to pivot on assets. So if you look at financial ownership, most of you might be familiar with the terrific report of the World Bank, which is the Findex, which looks at financial inclusion every 2 years. And I think what we were hoping for is what hasn't happened. We hoped for digital financial payment services being the panacea of inclusion and driving up account usage and closing gender gaps. And in fact, the sad news is between 2011 and 2018, the gap has been exactly the same, 9%. And that hides even further, regional differences. In South Asia, the gap is much higher. It's like 38%. So even when we look at just the basics, which is bank account ownership, we haven't seen the progress that we need to be seeing in order to move things forward. One more just quick example around the asset ownership is also the insurance sector, something that not very many people are talking about. But if you look at insurance products, most of them are tailored not with women's needs in mind or women's specific risks. So again, what we found is that actually the insurance industry could make 1.7 trillion if they were properly insuring women in emerging markets. But that is not really fully understood as to what to do about it and how can businesses and governments go about of leveraging change. So a couple more points in terms of what are some of the systemic failures that influence jobs and asset gaps. And what can laws and regulations that need to be changed help us in terms of changing some of that? So one detriment to any economic productivity is sexual harassment and gender-based violence. And so just WHO, still confirms it's 1 out of 3 women globally that experience gender-based violence. But in some countries, and IFC has done a lot of work in fragile markets in Myanmar and Solomon Islands, in fact, that number goes up to 2 out of 3 women experiencing gender-based violence. And it's not just women who experience violence, but it's transgender, LGBTQI, and other minorities that oftentimes experience sexual harassment at work or at the home. And that stymies productivity. It has tremendous and profound effects, of course, on impacts on the victims, but it also has impacts on governments, public and private institutions. The second underlying very sticky challenge is the much cited and not much done about care equation. I'm sure all the men in this room are not exempt from this, but overall 75% of all care responsibilities still fall to women. And that is exceeding in many other parts of the world like South Asia, where, for example, in India, it's 10 times more of care work that women execute than their male counterparts. Now, what we are trying to do in terms of resolution, it's not to say, well, women shouldn't be taking care or men shouldn't take care of their kids and their household activities, but everyone should make choices. And the choices for women have, of course, been significantly more limited because of social cultural norms. And then last, to say where we're standing in terms of legal reforms and where do we see key progress and key gaps. Well, if you look at the Women, Business and the Law report that I'm sure most of you in this room and online are familiar with, and if you're not, I would really encourage you warmly to pick it up. It's extremely helpful. 2019 edition did something that hadn't been done before, which looked at a decade of legal reform process when it comes to women's participation and economic participation. And it found that overall 130, and here's the good news, 131 countries actually took 274 reforms, which influenced the choices that women can make at the workplace. These are, for example, making it illegal to sexually harass at the workplace. 35 countries have taken that step. Making it possible for women to get a passport without the husband's consent. Making it possible for women not to have to obey their husbands, which was still the case in DRC. So there's legal changes that have been made. Also looking at providing the private sector with actual incentives to provide childcare support. That's been done by 25 economies. So we see a whole range of legal changes that have happened. And so there's 6 countries in this world which had complete now legal parity. Latvia, Belgium, Sweden, Luxembourg, and a couple of others, France. So for those, good news, but we also know obviously laws in the books doesn't mean actually that the implementation is working quite so well. So we have more to do. One thing, because Raj mentioned the DRC, and usually we hear the DRC oftentimes in the news for not so good things. The DRC actually has been found to be the top reformer in the Women, Business and the Law. They reformed the fastest. They also came from a very low base. So there was more to be done. And one thing that's also maybe of interest is to see where have regions reformed fastest, and that was on average South Asia, where we have seen the most legal progress compared to many others. Where we see the lowest base and still quite a lot of discrimination on the legal side of things is in the Middle East and North Africa. But actually on the practice side of things, when you look at private sector movement, and so we have seen extreme interest from the Middle East and willingness and openness to accommodate women as employees, as consumers, as leaders, more so than perhaps in some other regions. So we have to be quite nuanced.
Yeah, so you brought up the role of the private sector in sort of addressing some of these reforms, and that you don't always need some of these reforms or some of these tweaks to come from a government leadership or a change in the regulatory environment, but that the private sector, in fact, well, in some cases can push governments in those directions, but in other cases can actually take internal action. I know that's something that at IFC you've been looking at, particularly in the childcare space. But how, how do you think companies are starting to look at these issues? Is it changing? I think often, sort of women's economic empowerment was an issue that companies were like, yeah, that's a really good place to put our CSR dollars. It'll look really good for us. But in fact, then their practices maybe weren't aligned with some of the efforts they were making. Do you think we're actually seeing a shift in action on some of those things? And what more do you think could be done? Are there certain sectors that you think, okay, these sectors actually are taking this more seriously now, and others that maybe are lagging?
Yeah, let me start with maybe perhaps the concrete example of childcare, and just also to illustrate how important it is that the public and the private side come together. So what we've done together with the World Bank and other colleagues is to look at, first of all, finding out what countries are already actually legally mandating the private sector to provide childcare. And it was interesting, 25 economies out of 189 are already asking companies to provide childcare support. 18 economies are actually pegging that and triggering that to the number of female employees, which might not just be that helpful. It's a good step and well-intended, but that's how policy needs to slightly change, because of course if you say number 51 woman you hire, maybe that number 51 will never be hired, right? So we have to be careful the way we make policy, but the intent was absolutely right. Then the private sector turns to us and say, well, all well and good for us to provide childcare support. We have no idea how to do that. We know horticulture, flower production, or whatever. How can we be liable to provide affordable, safe, quality childcare? And so the first thing you need in order to bring sort of, I think, rigor into a conversation is evidence. And so what we've done is to work with clients around the world, all sectors, male-dominated, female-dominated, balanced, rare, but balanced sectors, where we tried to help companies understand the before and after of implementing childcare support to their working parents. And it was pretty staggering what we found, because we found that actually while companies would initially see childcare support as a cost center and cost that they're sinking, we turned it around. We could prove to them that actually they're making significant savings because they had reduced absenteeism, significantly reduced sick leave, much higher retention rates, meaning lower training costs, and much more diversity because women would come back after maternity leave. And that held true from countries in Jordan to India to Japan, so both developed and developing markets. But now what are we going to do with that, right? We could go one by one company and spend the next possibly 2,000 years dreadfully, chucking away at that. And I think that's where our creating markets effort and approach comes in. We are now taking and working collaboratively with 30 organizations, Oxfam and UNICEF and Brookings and many others in that space to provide some level of guidance as to what means private sector enabled childcare. It doesn't mean necessarily a crash at the workplace or necessarily a backup childcare program. It has to be tailored to local needs, the public sector, opportunities for partnerships, as well as, of course, the employment and the sectors at rural and urban. And it's staggering because we launched this report on the evidence in 2017, and we have seen a huge amount of uptake and interest of companies as well as governments in really trying to resolve for it, because I don't think if we get further ahead in that question, we can throw all kinds of initiatives on top of it in terms of economic empowerment. We won't have the effect, and the return of investment will be pretty dismal. Now, to your questions in terms of where companies land at when it comes to engaging on closing gaps between men and women, the way we look at it is a pyramid. So you see corporate leadership gaps. Second one is workforce gaps. Third one is supply chain gaps. And we have WeConnect International as well in the room, who does terrific work on closing some of these supply chain gaps, which are sticky. Consumers, and then community. And to no surprise, the further you go away from the company, the harder it is to engage, because you have a lack of sex disaggregated data. So corporate leadership, usually as an investor, public or private, how many women and men are you having in your corporate leadership at the C-suite? Workforce, you still have data. Then you go into consumer, it already gets pretty bleak. If you ask a bank, insurance company, housing company, how many women are using your services, how many male-owned or female-owned businesses are you banking with SME credit, most management information systems have not that level of granularity, and most folks have never thought about it. It isn't ill intent, it was just designed to be default without gender qualifiers in it. And so we see getting data from the private sector is a key issue. So I agree with you, in some parts of the world, we have moved from CSR conversations into core business conversations, but I still think that we are lacking the willingness to share power, because in some cases, in particular in the corporate leadership, I mean, if you look at the stickiness of gaps, political and corporate leadership is the most sticky one. And why? Because it means sharing power. And it's not something that's been done so much over the past 2,000 and more years. So it's been really something that's been particular challenge. Workforce, we've seen a lot more initiatives, right? We see a lot more diversity inclusion efforts. We see a lot more conversations around what can we do internally to become a more inclusive, safe, and productive workforce. When you look at the consumer, you have fast-moving consumer goods, and some companies have tried to tailor their products to women consumers' needs. But if you look at banking and insurance and so on, it's pretty still standard that there's one size fits all, and that we haven't really taken the time to better tailor products and services, and in particular distribution channels. Because if you only have, distribution channels that are very male-dominated, you are not able to create the trust and the product conversation, the relationships that actually make you as a consumer trust the institutions, because you see only one gender. Lastly, and maybe just a little bit of propaganda, I feel if Raj is holding up his book, I can also hold up something. It's not my book, I just be very humble here. But it's quite a good report that we've done together with Oliver Wyman and Rock Creek, and it looks, because you asked what is really tricky, which sector? Private equity and venture capital. So we had a lot of data points on gender gaps in private equity and VC from the developed markets, mostly US, UK, and a couple others. But when it came to emerging markets, we knew very little in terms of, where are women positioned as investment decision makers in the portfolio companies and so on. So we looked at about 700 funds, and we interviewed 500 LPs, GPs, and so on and so forth. And it's the largest data set now that has proven that gender-balanced funds, and we define gender balance as at least 30% of any one gender, have 10 to 20% higher returns. And that's good. But when we look at what is the landscape, we've seen that only 15% of GPs are actually gender balanced in emerging market when it comes to senior investment decision making. 15%. 70% are all male. If you look at the portfolio company level, it's slightly better. You have 20% of gender balance at the portfolio investee company level. And then the rest, is mostly all male. But interesting enough, even for the portfolio company level, what we found is gender balanced ones have higher valuation of 20 to 25%. So that's really good news. And then mostly also when we see gender balanced investment teams, actually 12% of private equity and VC funding goes to women. Still not great, but compared to all male teams, it's only 7% of private equity and VC funding that goes to women. So if you look at key sectors where you really need to see accelerated change in order to make sure that A, you're obviously creating inclusive growth, but also jobs as well as making a difference, it is private equity, venture capital, and transport. Private equity and venture capital is a bit elusive and niche, but transport is something that everyone's using, and transport systems are changing very fast. And if you look at the male-dominated providers of transport systems, public and private, that's an area where we feel women are excluded from the mobility for social cultural norms, but also from pure infrastructure design features.
So one of the, you bring up this issue of sort of the private equity, the investment space as being a key problem. And that in some cases, companies just aren't thinking about taking into account some of these metrics that could be really helpful in moving things forward. International financial institutions like the IFC invest a lot of money. And through that, you have significant power, in fact, to influence the companies that you're investing in. You can require certain metrics in your reporting structures. You can work with them on their policies and have certain thresholds for being able to receive money from the IFC. And it's not only IFC, it's other IFIs. It's something that the broader financial markets could do as well. But given an organization like the IFC's position and your mission, what more can IFC be doing to push companies in that direction?
Excellent question. And one of the trickier ones, because you have to walk the talk in order to obviously then ask your companies to change the way they're reporting out sex disaggregated data. So one of my big ambitions is, we have a terrific Banking on Women program, and if you wanted to look that up, it's really worthwhile. It invests in over 74 financial institutions and has now deployed 2.1 billion in capital and dedicated SME financing to fill the credit gap for women entrepreneurs. But indeed, I want to influence the other 21 billion that we spend per year, right? So that's where we need to go, in addition to filling the credit gap. And so, I'd like to just give a couple of examples of where I think we've done well and where we could do more. So where we've done well, similar to the private sector, is to go where we are really closest to our pyramid in terms of diversity inclusion at our corporate leadership level with clear targets. But also we've become EDGE Gender Certified, one of the many acronyms. So it's Economic Dividend for Gender Equality. So this point is a good time to check whether you are all still awake and with me in this room. Who is working for an employer that has more than 300 employees? Be proud, raise your hand. Yep, big bureaucracies, great. So all of you could get EDGE Gender Certified. And I hope one takeaway from today's conversation is that you might march into your CSO's office. Mark's already here, so he can already take that on and get EDGE Gender Certified. What is it? It looks at and triangulates HR data with policy, with an employee survey, and really looks at where your key gaps are in recruitment, retention, and promotion of women within the company. We did it 2 years ago for the first time. There are 3 levels, and it's public, so I'm not spilling any dirty laundry or whatever. We got levels 1, so it's the lowest level. But it was very clear that we have actually matured and accelerated progress, and now we have just been recertified. And it's been very helpful because it, again, gives you an evidence base that is done by a third party, and it shows a mirror. And it tells you as an institution where you're at when it comes to flex policies, when it comes to gender wage gaps, when it comes to training investments. And what's been really interesting is that a lot of times we hear, we know all of that. We don't need anything else. But what's been enlightening is that sometimes there's a mismatch between the policies and the perception of employees, and these gaps can then actually be closed out. And so that's sort of something we've done, and the nice thing is, if one institution moves, the others move. So ADB has done it, EBRD has done it, and so that creates a bit of peer pressure, and that's the beauty in working with the private sector. If you do one thing with an insurance company like we did in the Philippines, another insurance company comes along and say, can we do that as well? So that's been very helpful. The next step we have done is supply chain. We've looked in our own supply chain. We found, we wanted to know how many purchasing orders are we doing with women-owned and male-owned companies. And to our surprise, and we asked the question for the first time, only 3.7% of our 1.6 billion annual administrative spend is going to women-owned enterprise. Now you can say, boo, the World Bank Group, that's so low, but actually compared to, and that's not a figure I'm very proud of, compared to the rest of large corporations, it's actually higher because the average is between 1% and 2%. It's really low. So we asked the question, and now we've set a target to doubling it. Now it comes
That's
to...
still a pretty small number.
It is a very small number, but I think...
Is that an ambitious enough goal?
I think it's a goal that sets people up to succeed rather than fail. And I think if you want to tackle an issue that's very tricky and stubborn, we're in the 21st century, and we are still like at 1% to 2%, there's a reason for why we're at that, right? And it comes back to the entire enabling an ecosystem. And I think we can control for some things, but we might not be able to control for the entire ecosystem. I think it's good to set a starting point and reach it because it motivates to go higher. I wouldn't say it's highly ambitious, but I think it's ambitious enough to change where we need to go. Now, where can we do better? Which is looking at influencing data collections on the private sector side. And so we have started in the banking industry, very heavily so, but we can expand that to housing finance. We can expand sex disaggregated collections and reporting back on insurance. We can do that for the garment industry, manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So I think taking what we've done really well on banking into all the other sectors is clearly what we need to do more of. And then in an ideal world, we at some point will say, look, if you don't have a gender balanced team and your investment in a fund, we'd like you to put in place a pipeline that shows us within the 3 year of the investment or 5 years of the investment horizons, we want to see a succession plan that gets you from currently 0% of women in your senior leadership to 30% of women in your senior leadership. So conditioning some of our investments ever more so on some of the gender-related outcomes is, I think, something where we can make further progress on.
And there are other players who are doing this, who are setting some standards or requiring a policy in that case. And certainly starting to look at some of these gender factors in every investment decision they're making. So I'm curious how IFC can sort of help push the needle on some of that. I know you're leading on some of these discussions, and there's certainly other initiatives at other DFIs that are working on some of these things. I know that at OPIC, for example, their head of their women's initiatives now actually sits on the investment committee and has a role in making investment decisions. So I think there are things institutions can do. So what more do you think can be done at that decision-making junction?
So actually, I'm glad you're bringing up sort of the more larger DNAs and looking at every investment yields, because we look at investment yields in two ways. One is through a methodology that's the anticipated impact monitoring and measurement framework, and we have embedded gender right up in front so that each deal is being looked at exactly as to how does that deal advance underserved communities, either in job creation, in access to consumer goods, in whatever it may be in terms of the dimensions. So that's been front-loaded now so that each project is being asked that question. But then also on the risk side, our environmental and social standards, and we haven't zoomed in the beginning of our work very much on the risk side because we wanted to make sure we see closing gender gaps as a business opportunity and not necessarily a box-ticking and compliance piece. But because gender-based violence has been such an issue for us at the World Bank that we really grappled with and have put a lot of efforts and resources and minds to changing some of the practices when we go into procuring contractors, when we have large labor influx, when we get into the infrastructure sectors. So there again, we have sharpened our own toolbox. We have now actually just finalized a gender risk assessment on every investment deal, having to go through a gender-based violence risk assessment. We've piloted that with Nachtigall, big, large investment in Cameroon. We've piloted it with Solar Park in Egypt, and that's a public tool that we would love other DFIs as well to use. But I think peer pressure and communal learning is, what's required. And again, as I said, I think oftentimes IFC has been at the forefront. But there are at least a lot of bilaterals now who are really catching fire and really investing political capital in that. And I welcome that because I want to be in a peer group of people that challenge each other and say, hey, we have found something that works better. And I would love to hear about it because at the end of the day, we need community because it still at time can feel like a bit of a lonely road, right? So in terms of making, concise and very impactful progress. So OPIC, obviously is very heavily involved in initiative 2X, but together with other 6 other DFIs. And I think that was almost like, a response to the Women Entrepreneurship Finance Initiative. But the main point I'd like to make just to close out on this question is all these initiatives are absolutely needed in order to create political will and momentum, like in the G7 now, huge attention to changing laws under the French leadership. But already the name initiative shows you that something is maybe amiss, right? I mean, in the end, we need to become, a movement rather than an initiative, because otherwise I feel like connecting also into informal workers, connecting into, grassroots organizations, and really trying to make this a little bit more of a, concerted effort that is also led from the ground up and from the top down, I think is important because otherwise we kind of go from initiative to initiative as opposed to large-scale infrastructure changes and changing of the systems rather than the symptoms.
Yeah. So in just a few minutes, we're going to come to you guys for questions, so get your questions ready. But I have one more question, and I'm really glad you brought this up because I think we're in an era where we're seeing a lot of initiatives around women's economic empowerment, right? We have WeFi at the bank. We have 2X, both at OPIC and the G7 version, as you mentioned, and the WGDP, which was launched earlier this year by the administration. And I think that one of my questions is how can all of these various initiatives that are popping up work together and not either sort of duplicate efforts or at times potentially work at cross purposes, even though they have similar goals? And so what needs to happen to sort of take advantage of the fact that you have these initiatives popping up to really make them get to that level where it's sort of movement building and not just an exercise in, oh, it's really nice to say that we're working on this thing, but we're putting a little money towards this, but to really turn it into something that goes beyond that.
So I think we need three pillars. We need research, and there I think there's no limits to collaboration, because the more data sets you have, the better, and there's very little competition. And so I think coming together around increased harmonization around results and creating more evidence is key. Second one is investments, and we are oftentimes co-investors in deals, right? So aligning our systems and processes so that we don't ask our clients 3 different sets of gender questions, which is very cumbersome for clients who are working in very constrained environments. And then the third pillar is advice. And we have very different models on how we give advice. And as an IFC, so what we're doing in the way we give advice is we generally ask our clients to cost contribute, because we feel if you don't cost contribute, you don't have a stake in it and you don't fully own what the advice outputs is. And I think that's been really important for us to make sure that we have a cost contribution. So I think there's alignment already happening on actually all those tracks, because not all DFIs have an advisory piece. And so they bring us in and we provide some support and technical expertise to their clients. And we are trying to harmonize on our investments in terms of our due diligence. We have a very active multilateral development banks working group on gender. We also have a DFI working group on gender that's very, very proactive. Now the effort are in a way to harmonize them and to bring them more together. But then I think it's important in Canada and Australia and France and Sweden, and so have been really at the forefront also to tie that back into political efforts. You will have seen obviously a lot more governments labeling or classifying themselves as feminist international policies and trade policies and so on and so forth. So we obviously are part of a political economy, and so actually tying those dots together to the G7, the W20, the G20 and so on is key. So otherwise we have all our each individual initiatives, so having that together is important. But then also I think is the market is so big. I mean, the gaps are so big. I'm not worried to have too many players. I mean, we speak 2% of women CEOs, 7% of private equity funding going to women, only 48% of labor force participation globally, but in some countries as low as 18%. So I feel the more the merrier, and the more inclusive and the more empowering we can be to other partners who want to join that, the better. And last but not least, I would say in women's economic empowerment, we often focus, and that's how I started, jobs, assets, and so on and so forth. We cannot get there without effective access to reproductive rights for women, and we cannot get to economic empowerment with the availability of good maternal health. And so even though oftentimes we think in silos, right, oh, we are here focused on economics, but without health and education, and we've made a lot of progress on health and education, but in pockets, in the Sahel, in West Africa and other places, we still have very sticky education gaps. And so we cannot forget that economic empowerment means underlying access to quality services that are affordable and available to all.
Great. Well, now we'll go to you guys and give you guys an opportunity to ask questions. Do folks have questions that they want to ask? All right, we'll come here first. And can you just make sure to, a mic's coming for you, make sure to introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Hello, my name is Myra Smir. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm working as a gender and social inclusion consultant at the World Bank. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and mentioning the efforts that IFC and the World Bank Group is doing to make women more inclusive in the workforce. But you mentioned all the gender inclusive efforts at the policy level. But if we go back towards the bottom of the pyramid completely, for example, I'm from Pakistan, there are so many women that are not even aware of the opportunities they can get. Issues like gender-based violence, sexual harassment, they're not even aware that, what are our rights. So what efforts would you put to, reach out to the women at the very grassroots level? I mean, they are the target beneficiary, I guess, and how would you involve them in the process of enhancing women economic empowerment? Thank you.
Great. Do we have other questions?
I have a question. Alan Robbins with Devex. I think I heard some visible sort of oohs and ahs around the 2% or 3% sourcing from women-owned businesses. I would like to learn a bit more about is that women majority-owned, are public companies included, sort of a bit more about the methodology around that would be fascinating for me because it seems like such a low number.
Yeah. Great. All right, great. So in terms of grassroots and building, sort of communities from the bottom up, I think that's where we come really strongly together as a World Bank Group. And as you probably are aware, we are also one of the largest microfinance investors. And so obviously there we're targeting much more, women who are at the subsistence farming level and really take out much more smaller loan sizes. And increasingly what we're doing on the both SME side as well as on the microfinance side is to build a suite of holistic services that can strengthen women entrepreneurs at the micro and SME level in 6 dimensions. And they start all with C. It's maybe a bit gimmicky, but it helps me remember what those are. So confidence is one, capacity, capital, community, because oftentimes women are much more isolated than their male counterparts when it comes to networks. Connection, because we know the tech gap is still significant in terms of pure ownership of mobile phones, 23% of a gender gap in mobile internet access. And then the last one is contracts. So we've started most of our work originally, focused very much on confidence, capacity, and capital. But actually over the past couple of years in terms of learning, but also very great work that the Gender Innovation Lab at the bank has done to go more in terms of finding out what actually works when you talk about building business impact. A lot of it had to do with community building, connections, and contracts. And so we've expanded that, including actually at the micro entrepreneurial level. I'm generally, and people who've worked with me for a while, don't hone in so much on microfinance because oftentimes in people's mind it's already women equal micro. And I want to get to the point that I'm like, no, women equal all asset classes, all jobs, all leadership opportunities. It's kind of trying to get out of a narrative that women are all the time at the bottom of the pyramid, but not to minimize your question at all. But it's absolutely essential to be at all levels and to work on the most underserved communities, but not to forget that some of the growth stimulation can also happen on the other end, and to basically almost have like a holistic, approach to the ecosystem. And so we work very closely on that with the World Bank as well as with organizations like WeGo, who do phenomenal work on informal sector workers, and really trying to also in our childcare work, we reached out to them quite a bit because what we see, we also don't want to create a 2-class system where all of a sudden childcare is available for formal workers only and not for informal workers. So how can we make sure that we bring in informal workers in particular? Like, for example, we've looked at South Africa where we're investing in a fruit company to make sure that childcare is available not just to seasonal workers, but also to the surrounding communities. So where we can, we try to make an effort to reach into the segment, but it doesn't always necessarily align easily with our business model. Now, coming to supply chains, and so obviously each country often has its own definition on women-owned, women-led. IFC is using one definition that's been widely accepted, which is at least 51% women-owned or 20% women-owned and then 50% women-led. And so we have definitions that we use, but we're also very respectful that each government, in some instances, has its own definitions. So when the research originally was done, and actually we have Reconnect in the room, and so maybe, I don't know if Michael wants to talk a bit more about, because I'm citing your work. It's always good to go to the source directly. But when we look at spend, obviously we look at, working with big corporates who already have inclusive sourcing targets like Exxon, Walmart, and others. A lot of the movement is coming out of multinationals headquartered here in the US. Then we look at asking them, in terms of spend, how much are they spending on women-owned vis-a-vis male-owned companies, and then extrapolate out, because there's no data set that covers the world in all sectors. So that's how most of the research has been done. But Michael, did you want to come in? I don't know if there's a mic for you to chime in.
Hi, good morning. Michael Tobolsky with WeConnect International. So we are a corporate-led organization, including the World Bank, Microsoft, Apple, ExxonMobil, about 86 companies that are all committed to spend with women-owned businesses. And so in the U.S., this has been going on for maybe 40 years around supplier diversity, but outside of the U.S., this is still a new concept. There are many women businesses that don't even realize that companies want to buy from them, and at the same time, corporations don't know that there are women businesses already in their supply chains that they're doing business with. So our goal is really to get out there and make sure that we identify where the women businesses are, B2B, and then connect them with the multinational corporations that are looking to buy. So our goal, based on what our corporates have said, is that they have to be 51% or more owned, managed, and controlled by one or more women. And that way they know that the women are really the ones in charge. So what we do includes site visits where we go out and look to see who's actually making the decisions. How did they come up with the money? It was not just a transfer of paper. It was really legitimately run by the women businesses. So to give you some numbers, the highest corporation we have spend with is doing about 1.9% of their global spend with women. So about a third of the businesses that are privately owned are owned by women outside of the U.S. So there's still a huge gap. But I would say the average is about 1%. And I just wanted to make sure that it's clear. When you say double your spend, it's by 2023, which is a pretty aggressive goal. So you imagine how long it takes to get everybody on board and, you know, fight the old issues that people think that, well, we're going to have suppliers and you have typically men making the decisions and getting them on board to make sure that they understand why there's value. The great thing about this is it doesn't cost any more money to help empower women through inclusive sourcing. It's really about giving women the opportunity to bid on these contracts. So one of the things we do is we help develop capacity and get them involved and ready. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry to put you on the spot. But it's always good to have a very well-informed audience.
Do we have other questions? Folks have other questions?
Hi, I'm Leticia with Global Citizen, and we do work very closely with We Connect International and encouraging citizens around the world to hold their corporate members accountable to actually boost their procurement with women-owned businesses. I guess just to piggyback off that, obviously the World Bank target to double spend by 2023 is really significant, and I believe it's the first big public institution to set that sort of target. As part of your work with, you know, the working group on gender you mentioned with other MDBs, is the World Bank already sharing best practices with institutions like the African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, et cetera? And is there any way that we could encourage them to set similar targets as well?
Excellent question. And we are well on the way to both share practices with our colleagues, IDBs, for example, actually doing also some terrific work in that space. So we are also humble. Actually, to be very honest, the private sector has more expertise and experience in inclusive sourcing than we have. So we first had to build our own capacity. And so we've actually been very grateful to connect with large corporations that have made targets publicly ahead of us. And so I think it's sort of, you know, we come to this journey actually a little later than a private sector, but indeed, as you said, we are the first institution to publicly commit to something. And now we're taking others on this journey. I think it's not just about the MDBs, but also if you look at government spend, right? Of course, we are working with the World Bank Group in all countries of this world, and each government makes decisions on how are they spending their procurement dollars and how to get more transparency into procurement procedures so that you level the playing field so that women-owned enterprises can apply equally. So in Chile has made some great efforts in this. Kenya has also set aside a target for their own spend from government. So it's 30% that the government needs to spend on women-owned companies. And that's been, I think, in place, I might be wrong, but about 2-3 years. And we've seen some increase in that. But we also see in some instances, if you set targets, that actually there could be a sort of slight backlash on sexual harassment and extortions, because conversations are happening, I give you the contract if I get XYZ back from you. So there is an additional layer that we need to build in, you know, safe workplace, safe procurement policies, and also, you know, maybe coming up with a system which we currently don't have, where we blacklist companies that actually have, you know, violate discrimination and sexual harassment policies, and so where the workers are really sort of not obliging to the code of conduct that has been agreed. So I think there's more work to be done as well on that front. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
I wanted to ask you also about Wi-Fi.
Mm-hmm.
It got a lot of attention when it was launched, and you know, it's sort of in progress, working on getting stuff done. So can you give us an update on sort of where things stand? Obviously, part of its aim is sort of on some of the legal and regulatory barriers, but also mobilizing substantial amount of capital.
Yeah, so Women Entrepreneurship Finance Initiative has been in place now 1.5 years in terms of its actual starting point. And we've seen, I mean, there's been 2 rounds of proposals that have been allocated, and it's really nice because we see now a broader set of stakeholders who have been awarded programs. And so we have been, you know, very successful at the international finance corporations in really innovating around new products and services, and kind of learning from what we've done and taking Wi-Fi money to both scale but also to innovate. And so just to give you a couple of practical examples, we had done some work around insurance on a research piece, but we wanted to find out, well, how can we better financially protect women in emerging markets, in particular in low-income settings? And so we've been really excited with Wi-Fi. We've been able to get insurance companies in challenging markets, Cameroon and Ghana, and then slightly less challenging but still very important markets like the Philippines to really commit to changing their products and services and to opening up their books to make sure that women are explicitly part of their distribution channels, that actually women are explicitly part of their consumer base and can influence from the bottom up, coming back to your questions, the design, using human-centered design methodologies. So we don't design and prototype insurance policies, from a corporate view, where the risks and the profiles of risks are completely different to actually a seller of, like a small stall or whatever, which has very different risk profiles and risk needs. So that's been one really particular exciting angle. We've also been able, which is wonderful, to dig into the supply chain piece. So actually the partnership with We Connect International is coming out of it because WeFi is very clear in the governing committee of 14 governments that they don't want the MDBs just to pocket the money and spend it, but to create, to your earlier point, synergies in the ecosystem and to partner and to share some of those financing opportunities with our partners around the world. And so we've seen some really good innovative partnerships. We've also expanded our startup capital work. So we've partnered with Village Capital, we've partnered with an Ethiopian tech startup to expand the access to women who are able to become coders and set up tech businesses. And so we've seen quite a lot of innovation and movement in that space. And we're particularly thrilled that now we can be a learning community of 8 MDBs implementing programs, whereas before we've worked, tended to work more in isolation. I think there's now a real opportunity to come together. And the last thing I'd say is what I particularly like about WeFi is, although maybe the US has been in the news more and associated with it, the fund brings together a really diverse set of governments that have never worked together on women's economic empowerment. And to me, that's almost the most exciting part. We've never had Saudi Arabia, Russia, Norway, the Netherlands, the UK, the US, Germany, and so on and so forth, in one governing committee debating these issues. It was usually, much more led by the Scandinavians or, sort of more typical suspects and more, now we have a much more rounded engagement. And I think, to me, that's where transformation can really happen. So I'm looking at it with excitement. I mean, we have still a long way to go, but mobilization seems to be so far on track. And I think it's sort of spurred other people to set up their own sort of measures to come on board and really close gaps between men and women.
Great. Well, I do think we're sort of seeing an interesting moment for women's economic empowerment. And I think, one of the things that certainly at Devex we'll be watching is sort of where that goes, where all these programs sort of end up. Do they end up having an impact on the number of women who are in the corporate governance structure of companies? Does it have an impact on the small entrepreneur in Uganda in allowing her to grow her business, even if it's not to scale to the 3,000 employee level, but to 3? And I think that it's sort of an interesting moment, and so I just wonder how does the sort of broader development community try to capitalize on this moment that we sit in?
I think we need to bring in unusual suspects and create unusual alliances. And I think one key alliance is media. And we've seen that work in the UK pretty well because, you can think what you may around the disclosure requirement around the gender pay gap, because of course it crystallizes a very complex issue around gender inequities into one single figure, and you omit a lot of the nuances. However, it has really led to a conversation that's been on the top of the Financial Times week after week after week after week. And so the simplicity of that one figure allowed, sort of an audience that's not day in and day out breathing these conversations to come to terms with what does it mean to have a gender pay gap and how does it shortchange companies, but also, of course, families and women directly. And so I think media is an opportunity for us to get messages out. And I think we're very much technocrats and speaking a language that's not easily understood. And so I think if we want to capitalize on this moment, we need to let go of sometimes our academic and technical rigor and to say, let more flowers bloom. And even if it's not perfect and it's not the language we would have chosen, it allows us to have a conversation. And I think getting more people involved and organizations involved that are not necessarily the necessary go-to people, is how we need to capitalize. And if we don't do that in inclusion with men, I think we will be sitting here, sadly enough, in 20, 50, 100 years, and we could go over this conversation exactly as it is. And so I think if we are not successful in both making sure this is not we are better, we are stronger, women are this and men are that, I think that conversation isolates and separates. So we have to have a conversation as to how we, as both genders, create societies and leadership styles that work for the demands of the next generation, rather than being pitted against each other. And that's something that we've sadly seen in many political spectrums, and I think we need to be very careful to not go forward with divide and conquer, but really to make sure that we are stronger together.
Great. Well, on that note, our time has ended, so thank you everyone for joining us in the room, online, and most of all to you, Henriette, for joining us and having this important conversation. I certainly hope that the conversation is different a year from now, 5 years from now, 50 years
Me too.
from now. Thank you.
Thank you, Adva. Thank you.
And I just want to add my own thank you here at the end. That was a fabulous conversation, and hopefully you can see why it's important to dig deep on these issues. I learned a lot, was taking notes furiously, and you'll see some of this in our journalism going forward. I want to thank everyone who joined online. I want to thank especially Microsoft for this amazing space that they continue to allow us to use for these important conversations. And thanks to all of you for being here. That was fabulous.